This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
This is the Talking Animal Law podcast, brought to you by the UK Centre for Animal Law and hosted by Paula Sparks, Director of A-Law. But it's not just for lawyers, it's for anyone who cares about animals. So no matter who you are, if you want to know more about animal protection, news, ethics and animal law reform, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Talking Animal Law podcast. Today I'm really pleased to be talking to Amro Hussain, who is the Senior Public Affairs Lead for the Humane League UK. He's a political activist with over 5 years' experience of influencing the British government to act on human rights issues. As director of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief, Amro advised and supported over 130 British parliamentarians to champion the rights of persecuted religious and belief minorities from around the world. Amro now uses his experience of successful parliamentary engagement and lobbying to support the animal protection movement in his role at the Humane League. And we're talking today to Amro about fish. Amro, hello. Thank you for coming to talk to us today about fish.
Hi, Paula. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And this is an area I think quite a few people may not know terribly much about in terms of some of the problems that are facing farmed fish in particular, and also some of the regulation. And there is regulation around the farming of fish, the husbandry techniques, and requiring that fish should be spared avoidable pain, distress and suffering during their killing. We have some protections under the Animal Welfare Acts in the UK that should protect from unnecessary suffering. So tell us a little bit more about why, in your view, this isn't enough.
I'd be happy to. So the reason that the existing provisions from our perspective are not enough are because they're essentially quite vague. So as you mentioned, there's this generalized provision to prevent unnecessary suffering. Well, that applies to all farmed animals, including terrestrial farmed animals like cattle, sheep, pig, etc. All animals who are farmed in far fewer numbers than farmed fish. But all those animals also have detailed legal requirements specifying how they are to be handled, transported, stunned, and slaughtered.
Right.
So unnecessary suffering is avoided, but fish don't have that. Fish just have this vague provision. And what you have from that is a situation where farmers don't necessarily have the legal guidance that they need to satisfy their obligations to prevent unnecessary suffering. It means that welfare inspections don't really have any criteria against which to measure against by the government. And that obviously is a situation where it's very difficult to enforce any violations in the law if you don't have specific things to measure against. So this is it's problematic for enforcement. And essentially, there's a reason why all these other farmed animals have these extra level of detailed legal requirements. It's absolutely necessary. And so we're not calling for anything that's radical or different or unique. We're just asking for farmed fish to be given equivalent legal protection to terrestrial farmed animals.
That's really interesting. I think particularly the point about the lack of specificity, and picking up that point that if you don't have very clear specified standards, that can make it more difficult when it comes to inspections and having a benchmark.
Exactly. What can a welfare inspector measure against if there are no specific legal requirements? What can a court look at in terms of violations if there's only these very vague, broad terms? It would make it very difficult to prosecute.
In the 2009 EU regulation that protects animals at the time of killing or provides some legal protections, that does set out some separate standards for different types of animals, setting out in more detail the parameters around stunning and killing. Do you know why it was that separate standards for fish were not included at that time?
Well, the reason proffered was that there was further scientific opinion was needed. I think that has to be taken with maybe a pinch of salt. I think that the scientific consensus is and was rather well established with regards to fish and their sentience. I think it's more of a question, perhaps, really about the political will or public engagement on the issue. But the reason that they gave was that there was needed to be more scientific opinion. And if we accept that at face value, that there wasn't sufficient scientific opinion in 2009, I don't think we can say the same now. I think the science continues to grow.
So what further research has there been since 2009 about the welfare of farmed fish?
So there have been numerous academic studies, but also governments themselves have been looking into this issue. I know the EU commissioned a report in 2017 on the welfare of farmed fish. And closer to home in the UK, the government asked its own animal welfare experts, the Farmed Animal Welfare Committee, to provide an opinion on the welfare of farmed fish at the time of killing. And in 2014, those experts returned to the government saying that the farmed fish should have detailed legal requirements specifying things like stunning and how they should be handled, and other elements related to their welfare. So essentially, the government's own experts recommended what we're calling for, and they recommended that in 2014. And in fact, the government's own experts made a similar recommendation as far as back as 1996. So the evidence has only been growing since that time.
And have those recommendations from the studies, have they led to any change in the law?
Unfortunately not, no. I think there is, going back to what I was saying about political will and public consciousness, there doesn't seem to be a translation of essentially the scientific consensus and what we know about fish and their sentience into really political will on protecting farmed fish at slaughter. Fortunately, there has been a recognition in law that fish are sentient generally. So the provisions you mentioned, and in the Animal Sentience Act, the broad concept of their sentience is recognized. But there really hasn't been much movement on specifying welfare requirements there. I think people still think that fish have 5-second memories and that kind of thing. Just the reality of the situation hasn't really translated into the public consciousness.
So there's an element perhaps of the law lagging behind the science as well.
Exactly, yes. I think, to be totally honest, the parliamentarians and government haven't really been, I think the issue of farmed fish welfare hasn't really been raised to them that often because it's not necessarily in the public consciousness either. So I think there is a gap that needs to be made up in terms of the public understanding of these issues, but also the political understanding as well.
I know that you've been very active in terms of raising awareness and campaigning for better conditions and better laws and better policy for fish, and we'll come back to that. But before we do, I just want to ask you about your perspective on the enforcement of the laws that we do have.
My perspective is that it's unfortunately almost non-existent. I would say, in terms of farmed fish, there were no welfare inspections of any sort taking place on fish processing sites, which is quite shocking when you think about the number of animals that we're talking about here, millions and millions. We sent freedom of information requests, we at the Humane League, to various government departments maybe 2 years ago now, kind of trying to find out who was responsible for these inspections and who was conducting them. And what we found out was that no one was, and that all the agencies with potential responsibility thought that another agency was covering it. So a lack of oversight and responsibility being taken by government authorities. But while it's quite extreme in the case of farmed fish in that no inspections were taking place whatsoever, I'm afraid to say that this is probably not an uncommon fact in terms of animal welfare generally. The level of inspections aren't adequate. I believe I saw a report even just last week from the Animal Law Foundation that said that in the last 4 to 5 years, I think maybe it was 4 years, that only 3% of British farms have actually had an inspection. And that's really scandalous for a nation of animal lovers and a nation with so many laws on the books for animal welfare. So there is definitely an issue with enforcement. But that shouldn't stop us trying to get the regulations that we need in the law in the first place. We can't have enforcement if we don't have the laws. So that's why we're still campaigning.
No, that's excellent to hear. And we discussed these issues on an assumption that fish do have the capacity to experience pain, that they are sentient. And does the scientific literature confirm this?
Yes, quite unequivocally at this point as well. The science is very well established, and it's been done through numerous different ways that support each other. For example, people have looked at the anatomy of different fish species and seen that they have the things that one would expect that you would require to experience pain, in terms of anatomical structure and brain imaging and nerve receptors and those kind of things.
Yeah.
But there's also just more direct observational tests that we have been able to carry out, that science has looked at, that kind of indicate the sentience of fish. For example, there are tests where they might administer an injury or some kind of injurious chemical to fish in a tank, and they react in much the way you'd expect mammals to, or indeed humans. They withdraw, become socially withdrawn, don't sometimes, can be seen to be shaking or not eating or growing restless. And then when you administer an analgesic, painkiller to those same animals, then you see them return to their normal behaviors. They react in exactly the way you would expect an animal who's experiencing pain to.
And so, bearing that in mind, are fish usually stunned before being killed? When we're talking specifically about farmed fish rather than wild free-living fish.
Absolutely. In terms of farmed fish in the UK, what we can say is that thankfully the majority, and it's a very significant majority of fish farms, implement some form of stunning and are signed up to voluntary welfare schemes like RSPCA Assured, which set out guidelines for people participating on the scheme to how they should stun and slaughter and essentially maintain the welfare of farmed fish. So that is very welcome and very positive that these voluntary measures have been adopted by much of the industry. The problem is it's not all of the industry, and when we're talking about such an enormous amount of animals, that still means that millions and millions every year are being slaughtered without voluntary or statutory welfare protection at slaughter. So this is a huge welfare issue, and beyond that, even when farms choose to take voluntary measures or join into voluntary schemes, the problem with that is that they can leave those schemes, or more likely be undercut by producers who aren't as concerned by welfare, that can kind of create a race to the bottom with welfare issues. And of course, relying on voluntary codes alone also means that there is a problem with enforcement if there are any severe violations of farmed fish welfare. So broadly speaking, it's very positive that the industry have adopted these voluntary schemes, but they are far from sufficient.
It's interesting, isn't it, that point about some producers signing up to these voluntary codes and adopting good practices that will, I imagine, require some investment, and that putting them at a disadvantage to those who are just ploughing on regardless. And I suppose that's where the law comes in, to have a level playing field amongst those who, some of whom might voluntarily incentivize to good practice, but others not, as you say.
Exactly. I think that voluntary schemes like RSPCA Assured should be used to promote positive welfare. They should be being used to promote above and beyond the norm, the baseline legislative standards. But in the case of farm fish, there is no baseline legislative standard really. So the RSPCA have kind of come in to fill a vacuum here, but that isn't sufficient. The law should be there to provide that baseline, and then others can go beyond that should they choose to.
Yes. And is there any evidence that, notwithstanding the voluntary codes and the other matters that you've mentioned, that there are welfare violations at the time of killing, that we don't have the best welfare for farmed fish?
Yeah, I think that, as I said, thankfully many are signed up to those voluntary schemes and implementing their best efforts to try and to protect farm fish welfare at slaughter. But as I said, there are millions of farmed fish every year going through the aquaculture industry without these voluntary or statutory protections. So there's because there are no welfare inspections, we don't have numbers on exactly the violations and things, but we can infer that if they're not signing up to those schemes, you're not investing in them, then that means that the animals aren't being treated humanely. And when we do have investigations looking into those farms, what we do find is consistently violations of the welfare of farm fish.
And when we talk about farmed fish, what are the sort of numbers overall that we're talking about?
Yeah, I probably should have started that and said that at the beginning.
I should probably have asked you at the beginning.
Overall rough, it's hard to ascertain very individual numbers because of the way the industry calculates numbers of fish. They don't do it to individual numbers, they do it to tons of farm fish, which is an issue in itself, kind of identifying these individualistic sensitive animals as just a blob, a mass of production numbers. But what we can, based on kind of average weights and other estimates, we think that it's about over 70 million farmed fish are produced in this country every year. Not all of those farmed fish make it to slaughter for various different reasons. So we can say with some comfort that around 55 million to 60 million fish are slaughtered in the UK every year. And to put that in context, the numbers of cattle, sheep, pig combined that are farmed in the UK, farmed and slaughtered in the UK every year, around 27 million or so, 25, 27 million. So we're talking double the numbers are slaughtered, double numbers of fish are slaughtered in the UK every year.
Really high numbers, actually. It's quite staggering. So how is the Humane League and how are others trying to influence law and policy in this area?
Yes, so the main kind of focus point, I think, for a lot of the organizations operating in this area at the moment has been the Animal Welfare Committee. I mentioned them earlier as a body of governance expert, animal welfare experts, and they were asked almost 2 years ago or a year and a half ago now to produce an updated report on the welfare of farmed fish at the time of killing for the government. And I'm glad to say that that report has finally been completed and it's been handed into government ministers. Now, we don't know yet what that report says. The government hasn't made it public yet. We're not sure why they haven't made it public yet. But given that the previous two iterations of the committee in 2014 and 1996 recommended that specific stunning requirements should be outlined in law for farmed fish, and that the scientific consensus has only grown since those times, we're confident and hopeful that the Animal Welfare Committee will have again recommended to the government that they should implement this change in the law and give farmed fish equivalent legal protections to terrestrial farmed animals. It's a common sense recommendation, well established in the science. So we are trying to push the government, of course, to release this report and to get it out there, but also then to really accept the scientific consensus. We're trying to collaborate with other organizations and parliamentarians and others to really get the government to accept something which is a no-brainer, essentially. There's no scientific or ethical reason to not give fish the equivalent legal protection. So that's how we're trying to engage and move forward.
Mm. No, that's really interesting. So what next, Amro?
I think so. We're doing a lot of work trying to raise the profile of this issue among parliamentarians and the public. As I kind of said at the beginning, it's not necessarily a topic that too many people are familiar with, the issue of fish welfare. So a lot of the MPs that we speak to have never been lobbied on this issue at all from their constituents or otherwise. So we're really trying to build awareness among the political class and the public. And we actually recently had a parliamentary reception just in March, where we brought together parliamentarians, NGOs, vets, few celebrities, journalists, and even some major producers from the Scottish salmon industry to all come around together and say that this is a common sense policy change. It should already be in place, and to really push the government to do it, and to show that there is even essentially quite a substantial consensus among the stakeholders about this. The government didn't commit at that point, but the Labour shadow minister said that if the Conservative government didn't introduce this change, that they would, for all the reasons that I've outlined. So we're continuing to try and build this consensus, build awareness among parliamentarians, and to push the government to make this common sense change.
Excellent. So if people listening to this want to get involved and want to get engaged with this issue, what would be your advice to them?
I think the first protocol would be to contact their MP about it. I think sometimes that sounds a bit banal or not interesting, but I can't tell you how much it supports our work when the parliamentarians we engage have already heard about this issue or been lobbied about it. I think a lot of the parliamentarians who walked through the doors for our event that I mentioned, they only came because we had people in their constituencies emailed them about it. Farmed fish wasn't high on their agenda, but they came because people reached out to them. So that's really, really helpful for us. And if you want to learn a bit more about the campaign, to support that activity, or just to keep up to date about the campaign, they can visit the Humane League UK's website, thehumaneleague.org.uk, and there you can get all the information that you need.
Fantastic. Well, that's really helpful, and we'll also put a link to that on our podcast page as well, Amro, so that people can find it easily. But it's thank you. It's really heartening to know that actually the efforts that we make in contacting MPs, in raising awareness, actually can be impactful, because sometimes you think, oh, it's just going to go into the ether and no one's really listening. To actually hear it from that perspective, I think actually gives us some optimism.
Yeah, I think in a previous life I worked in Westminster and in the House of Commons, and from having that experience, I always recommend to friends, family, or anyone I speak to that they'll be surprised how responsive parliamentarians can be when they're contacted by a few of their constituents, even if it's not that they change their minds totally on an issue or a policy, but that they're willing to open their minds to it a little bit, or, for example, pop down to a parliamentary event and grab a briefing and learn what it's about. And those things really add up over time. So I encourage anyone on this issue or any issue that is close to your heart to actually contact your MP. It can have a big difference in the long run.
Oh, thank you. Well, look, it's been amazing talking to you, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for helping us to understand these issues and to raise awareness of some of the issues facing farmed fish, particularly at the time of their killing.
No problem at all, Paula. Thank you so much for having me and for creating this space where we can talk about these very important issues.
Oh, thank you.
All right, take care.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. And if you give us a good review, it will help others to find us. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss a show.
For more information about the work of the UK Centre for Animal Law, please go to www.alaw.org.uk.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.